Picture vast steppes where gusts of wind whip up pillars of dust and the night sky is scattered with countless shimmering stars. It was here, in the very heart of Central Asia, amidst harsh natural conditions and nomadic peoples, that one of the most remarkable civilizations in human history was born, the Turkic civilization. These people lived in yurts, easily portable and adapted to their nomadic lifestyle. Their roads were the endless steppes, where they moved freely in search of pasture for their livestock. The word of the leader was their law, enjoying unquestioned authority within the tribe. The main wealth of the Turks was their horses, indispensable in battle and everyday life, and of course weapons, which they never parted with. The Turks were originally nomads, and their whole life was closely connected with horses, livestock, and the ability to move quickly over long distances. They had no mighty stone walls surrounding cities and protecting them from enemies, but they did not need them. Their main defense was speed of movement, honed martial skills, and the art of survival in the most unfavorable conditions. They herded sheep, hunted, and knew how to adapt to harsh winters and scorching deserts. From an early age, children were taught archery and horseback riding, and adult men could easily cover hundreds of miles across the steppe. But why did these people leave Central Asia, their native steppe, where their ancestors had lived for centuries? There were several reasons. First of all, natural conditions were not always favorable for nomads. Droughts, severe and prolonged winters, and the reduction of pasture lands all forced the Turkic tribes to seek new lands more suitable for life. Secondly, the struggle for power between different tribes and clans played an important role. Turkic tribes often fought each other, and the losers were either completely destroyed or forced to leave their native lands in search of a new homeland. In addition, the influence of powerful neighbors should not be discounted. In the east, the Turks were dominated by the Chinese, who first tried to form alliances with them and then began to exert pressure using military force. The well-known Great Wall of China was built precisely to protect against nomadic peoples such as the Turks. To the south lay Persia, whose inhabitants treated the Turks as savages and barbarians. And to the west stretched vast, unexplored lands, where those who did not want to submit to stronger neighbors could go. However, it was not only fear and necessity that forced the Turks to leave their native lands. They always had a belief in a great future. They were not simply fleeing from danger, they were looking for a new place where they could become stronger and more powerful. They believed that the sky, personified by the god Tengri, would show them the right path. And one day, this path led some of the Turkic tribes to the west, where centuries later, one of the most powerful empires in history would arise, the Ottoman Empire. But at that moment, they were just small tribes crossing mountains, steppes and rivers in search of a new home, a new homeland, where they could find prosperity and greatness. Imagine a small nomadic tribe in the 13th century, slowly moving across the expanses of Asia Minor, constantly searching for a place to set up temporary camp. The people are exhausted by long journeys, but they are led by Ertugrul, a chieftain who steadfastly believes in the future of his people. His Kai tribe, like many others, had left their settled lands in Central Asia. The steppes could no longer accommodate everyone. Wars between tribes flared up one after another, and powerful neighbors steadily pushed the nomads out of their lands. At first, the Kai tribe moved westward, passing through lands already occupied by other Turkic peoples. Then they crossed the Caucasus Mountains and found themselves in Anatolia, a region where the weakened Byzantine Empire was engaged in a constant struggle with the Seljuks. It is worth noting that this time, namely the first half of the 13th century, was a period when the Ottoman Empire did not yet exist. Anatolia was a fragmented territory, divided between Seljuk emirs, the remnants of Byzantine power, and Mongol conquerors who posed a constant threat from the east. Armed conflicts occurred constantly in these lands, and Ertugrul quickly realized that in order to gain a foothold here, his tribe needed to find strong allies. According to legend, one day he and his warriors witnessed a fierce battle. One of the sides was clearly outnumbered and seemed to have no chance of winning. Without hesitation, Ertugrul decided to intervene and support the weaker side. It was a risky move, as he did not know who was fighting, but luck was on his side. Those he came to help turned out to be warriors of the Seljuk Sultan Kaikubad I, and their opponents were either Byzantines or Mongols, depending on which version of events you consider. After the victory, the Sultan expressed his gratitude to Ertugrul and in recognition gave him land in the area of the town of Söğüt. This moment was a turning point in the history of the Kai tribe. Now they were not just wandering from place to place, but had their own territory, albeit a small one. Ertugrul began to strengthen the settlement, establish relations with the Seljuks, and wage wars against the Byzantines, gradually expanding his possessions. Today, Söğüt is a small town in Turkey, located in the Bilecik province, not far from Istanbul. It was there that the first stones were laid in the foundation of the future Ottoman Empire. For modern Turks, this place has enormous symbolic significance, being the cradle of their great power. Here, in a place filled with historical significance, Ertugrul rests, and his tomb still serves as a place of pilgrimage for many people, paying tribute to his memory and contribution to the future. Ertugrul understood that he could not afford to engage in open battles against large and well-armed armies, so he relied on the maneuverability of his cavalry, sudden strikes, and carefully planned ambushes. Thanks to these tactics, his warriors were able to conquer more and more lands, gradually expanding their influence. Over the years of his reign, Ertugrul managed to transform the small Kai tribe from a group of nomads struggling for survival into a powerful military force that not only survived in this harsh world, but also dictated its terms to the surrounding neighbors. Unfortunately, Ertugrul did not live to see the moment when his descendants would create the Ottoman Empire that he may have dreamed of, but he laid a solid foundation for this great future. His son, Osman Gazi, inherited his wisdom and courage, continuing his father's work and building a state that would later become one of the most powerful empires in world history. After Ertugrul's death, his son, Osman Gazi, took over the leadership of the Kai tribe, inheriting the small territories around Söğüt. During this difficult period, the Seljuk Sultanate, to which the Turkic tribes were formerly subordinate, gradually lost its former influence due to the constant onslaught of the Mongols, while the Byzantine Empire desperately tried to maintain control over its fortresses scattered throughout Anatolia. Osman Gazi, being a far-sighted ruler, realized that dependence on weakening rulers did not promise his people a bright future. In approximately 1299, Osman made the bold decision to renounce submission to the Seljuks, declaring the independence of his Beylik, a small state that was destined to become a vast and powerful empire. To consolidate his power and gain a foothold in the new lands, Osman Gazi began a war against the Byzantine Empire. His main goals were small but strategically important fortresses that controlled important trade routes, bringing considerable income. He skillfully used the tactics of lightning strikes, besieging cities and blocking supply routes, thereby weakening the enemy. The Byzantine armies, accustomed to slow and heavy battles, were too unwieldy and heavily dependent on their fortifications, while the Turkish cavalry could strike quickly and unexpectedly and then retreat just as quickly. The first serious clash between the opposing sides occurred near the city of Nicaea, when the Byzantines sent an army there to stop the rapid advance of the Ottoman troops. Osman Gazi, showing tactical ingenuity, ambushed and routed the enemy. After this brilliant victory, his authority increased significantly, and new tribes began to flock to him, eager to fight under his banner, attracted by the prospect of glory and booty. Having established himself in the region, Osman Gazi continued his conquests. He captured the fortresses of Karakahisar, Bilecik, and Ineyhisar, and then began the siege of Bursa, a large Byzantine city that was an important trading center, bringing huge revenues. The Byzantines tried to send reinforcements to the besieged city, but their forces were significantly weakened by internal conflicts and the constant onslaught of Ottoman troops. The siege of Bursa lasted for a long time, and it was during this period that Osman Ghazi transferred command to his son Orhan, who would later successfully complete the conquest of this important city. There is a beautiful legend associated with the rise of Osman Ghazi, passed down from generation to generation. Osman often visited Sheikh Edebali, a respected and well-known spiritual mentor, famous for his wisdom. Osman Ghazi deeply respected the sheikh and valued his advice, and also fell in love with his beautiful daughter, Malhun Hatun. However, the sheikh did not give his consent to this marriage for a long time. One night, while staying at Sheikh Edebali's house, Osman had an amazing dream. A huge tree grew out of his chest, spreading its branches all over the world and giving cool shade to the nations. When he told Sheikh Edebali about this dream, he predicted that Osman would become the founder of a great state that would be famous throughout the world. After that, the sheikh gave his consent to the marriage of Osman Ghazi and Malhun Hatun. Osman Ghazi passed away around 1324, never witnessing the fall of Bursa, yet he laid the firm foundation for the future Ottoman Empire, which for centuries would exert a tremendous influence on the destiny of Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. His name became a symbol of the new power, and his descendants transformed a small state into a great empire, leaving an indelible mark on history. After Osman Ghazi's death, his son Orhan inherited his father's lands and faced the daunting task of expanding the state's borders. The Byzantines still controlled major cities in Anatolia, such as Bursa and Nicomedia, and maintained their influence in the region, but their forces were significantly weakened by internal conflicts and economic problems. Orhan began a systematic offensive on Byzantine territories, employing tactics that markedly distinguished Ottoman troops from European and Byzantine armies. The Ottoman forces did not rely on heavily armed warriors and protracted sieges of fortresses. Instead, they banked on speed, maneuverability, and weakening the enemy before a decisive attack. The Ottomans generally did not storm fortresses immediately, but rather surrounded them, cut off all supply routes, and forced the garrisons to surrender due to hunger and exhaustion. The Byzantines, accustomed to fighting according to classic rules, could not effectively counter such flexible and unpredictable tactics. The primary task for Orhan was to capture Bursa, an important city with formidable fortifications. He understood that a direct assault on the city would result in enormous losses for his army. Instead, Orhan decided to use cunning and offered the Byzantine garrison a favorable deal: gold in exchange for the peaceful surrender of the city. Exhausted by the long siege and deprived of hope for outside assistance, the Byzantines agreed to Orhan's terms, opened the gates, and allowed Ottoman troops into the city. However, as soon as the Ottomans entered Bursa, Orhan treacherously broke the agreement. The promised gold was never paid, and the defenders of the city were taken prisoner. This deception allowed Orhan to take Bursa virtually without a fight and make the city the first capital of the Ottoman state. After capturing Bursa, Orhan continued his offensive, seeking to expand the borders of his holdings. Nicaea, the former capital of the Byzantines in exile, soon fell, followed by Nicomedia. The boundaries of the Ottoman territories expanded significantly, and the state itself ceased to be merely a small Turkic principality, transforming into a serious power in the region. Orhan proved himself not only as a successful conqueror, but also as a wise ruler. He created the first regular army, laid the foundations of the future administrative system, and began the systematic transformation of the Ottoman Beylik into a powerful and centralized state. The Byzantine Empire effectively lost control over most of Anatolia, and the Ottoman troops closely approached the borders of Europe, posing an ever greater threat to European states. After consolidating their position in Anatolia, the Ottomans began to expand their influence beyond its borders. Their next target became the Balkans, a region consisting of many small principalities and kingdoms constantly feuding with each other. The Byzantine Empire by that time could no longer effectively defend its possessions in Europe, and the Bulgarian and Serbian kingdoms were weakened by internal conflicts and wars with Hungary. Seizing the favorable situation, the Ottomans began their advance into Europe. A pivotal moment in this process was the capture of Gallipoli in 1354. This city was located on the shores of the Dardanelles and controlled an important route from Asia Minor to Europe. Before this, Ottoman troops had raided the Balkans but could not establish a long-term foothold there. However, a powerful earthquake destroyed the walls of Gallipoli, and the Ottoman troops easily occupied the city without encountering serious resistance. The Byzantines demanded the return of Gallipoli, but Sultan Orhan flatly refused. From that moment on, the Ottomans gained an important bridgehead in Europe and launched a large-scale offensive into the Balkans. After Orhan's death, power passed to his son Murad I, who decided not to limit himself to disparate campaigns, but began a systematic and consistent conquest of the Balkan Peninsula. In 1362, he captured Adrianople, which soon became the new capital of the Ottoman Empire. Then, Murad continued his advance deep into the Balkans, subjugating Bulgarian and Serbian lands. In 1371, Ottoman troops clashed with the combined army of Serbs and Bulgarians on the Maritsa River. The Christian army outnumbered the Ottoman forces, but Murad used a military stratagem and attacked the enemy at night, catching the sleeping warriors by surprise. As a result of this battle, a significant part of Bulgaria fell under Ottoman rule, and the remaining Bulgarian principalities recognized their vassal dependence on the Ottoman Empire. Murad's next target was Serbia. Prince Lazar understood that if the Ottoman expansion was not stopped, his country would inevitably fall. In 1389, the historic Battle of Kosovo took place. The Ottoman army outnumbered the Serbian forces, but the Serbs knew the terrain well and prepared thoroughly for the battle. During the fierce battle, both sides suffered heavy losses. The key moment of the battle was the death of Sultan Murad I. According to one version, the Serbian knight Miloš Obilić managed to enter the tent of Murad I under the guise of a prisoner or defector. Once next to the Sultan, Obilić suddenly drew a dagger and fatally wounded Murad. Obilić was immediately killed by the guards, but his courageous act became a legend, inspiring the Serbs to continue their struggle against Ottoman rule. Despite the death of the Sultan, the Ottoman troops won the Battle of Kosovo. The Serbian army was defeated. Prince Lazar was captured and executed. After this, Serbia recognized its vassal dependence on the Ottoman Empire. Having conquered the Balkan Peninsula, the Ottomans turned their gaze to Byzantium. They besieged Constantinople but could not take it by storm. The city was well protected by powerful walls and received assistance by sea from Genoa and Venice, two major maritime powers of the time. The Ottomans did not have a strong fleet or powerful heavy artillery needed to break through the city's formidable defenses. The siege had to be lifted, but the Ottomans drew important conclusions. In the future, to capture Constantinople, they would need a strong fleet and powerful cannons capable of destroying the city's impregnable walls. After the conquest of the Balkan Peninsula, the Ottoman expansion continued. Serbia and Bulgaria became vassals of the Ottoman Empire. The Byzantine Empire weakened and was in decline, and the borders of the Ottoman possessions approached Hungary. The Ottoman state transformed into a powerful force, posing a serious threat to all of Europe. After several unsuccessful attempts to capture Constantinople, a strategically important city separating the European possessions of the Ottomans from the Asian ones, a ruler destined to bring this matter to an end, appeared on the historical stage. Mehmed II, later nicknamed the Conqueror, ascended the Ottoman throne in 1451. He was only 19 years old, but his mind and will were mature, and his main goal became the conquest of Constantinople, a city that remained a symbol of the former glory of the Byzantine Empire and the center of the Orthodox world. The Ottomans by that time controlled virtually the entire territory of Anatolia and the Balkan Peninsula, but Constantinople, like an impregnable fortress, stood in the middle of Ottoman lands, surrounded by powerful walls, protected by the sea, and receiving support from European allies in the west. Mehmed understood that the usual sieges, with the help of which his predecessors had tried to take the city, would not bring the desired result. The Byzantines had been building and strengthening the walls of Constantinople for many centuries, constructing towers and creating complex defensive structures. The main defense of the city was the famous Theodosian walls, 3 rows of powerful fortifications that could withstand attacks from any armies of the time. An open attack on these walls would be suicidal for any army, so Mehmed began to prepare carefully for the siege in advance, developing a complex and multi-stage plan. The first step towards the conquest of Constantinople was the construction of the powerful Rumelihisar fortress on the European shore of the Bosphorus. The construction of the fortress began in 1450, 3 years before the start of the siege of Constantinople. This fortress allowed the Ottomans to completely control the Bosphorus Strait and block the delivery of aid to Constantinople from the Black Sea. Thus, the city was completely blockaded, cut off from the outside world. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos understood perfectly that a deadly threat hung over his city, but he did not have enough forces to resist the powerful Ottoman army. He desperately hoped for help from the Catholic powers, but Europe at that moment was consumed by its internal wars and strife. In the spring of 1453, a huge Ottoman army of more than 80,000 men approached the walls of Constantinople. The Byzantines, whose population by that time had shrunk to 50,000 people, were able to gather only about 7,000 defenders, including mercenaries from Genoa and Venice. Their last hope remained the mighty walls of the city, which for many centuries had stopped the armies of conquerors. However, Mehmed had weapons that the previous sultans who besieged Constantinople did not have. He enlisted the services of a talented Hungarian engineer named Urban, who designed giant cannons capable of destroying even the strongest walls. The main cannon, called Basilic, was over 8 meters long and fired cannonballs weighing about 500 kilograms. For the first time in history, the Theodosian walls faced such a devastating weapon. The siege of Constantinople began in April. By day, Ottoman cannons methodically chipped away at the city walls, while by night, the Byzantines desperately tried to repair the breached sections. However, the walls proved too massive, and artillery bombardment alone wasn't enough to completely destroy them. It was then that Mehmed decided to employ a cunning military tactic. He ordered a portion of his fleet to be transported overland across the hills, bypassing the defensive chain that blocked the entrance to the Golden Horn, a narrow inlet on the European side of modern-day Istanbul, separating the historic center of the city from the rest of the mainland. In Byzantine times, the Golden Horn served as a natural harbor and a crucial defensive line for Constantinople. This inlet was ideal for mooring ships and also provided protection against naval attacks. The Byzantines had sealed off the entrance to the Golden Horn with a massive chain stretched between the city walls and the Galata fortress. This chain prevented enemy fleets from breaking through and attacking Constantinople from the sea. Mehmed's maneuver caught the Byzantines completely off guard, forcing them to divide their forces to defend the Golden Horn, thereby weakening the city's overall defenses. Ottoman forces also employed tunneling, attempting to undermine the walls from within. However, the Byzantines discovered these tunnels and destroyed them along with the besiegers. The siege dragged on, and discontent began to grow among the Ottoman soldiers. Many of the Sultan's advisors suggested retreating and ending the siege, deeming it hopeless, but Mehmed insisted on continuing the assault, despite the heavy losses and exhaustion of his troops. By May 29th, the city's defenders were utterly drained. The Byzantines were physically unable to repair the damaged sections of the walls quickly enough, and their morale was plummeting with each passing day. On the morning of May 29th, the final assault on Constantinople began. The first to storm the walls were the Azabs, lightly armed infantrymen who served as cannon fodder. Their task was to exhaust the city's defenders and divert their attention from the main forces of the Ottoman army. Then the Janissaries, elite troops composed of hand-picked warriors who fought without fear or hesitation, willing to give their lives for their sultan, entered the fray. In one section of the formidable Theodosian walls, a breach had formed due to the relentless bombardment from Urban's enormous cannons, and Ottoman troops, led by the Janissaries, poured into the city. Emperor Constantine XI, realizing that the city had fallen and that resistance was futile, threw himself into the thick of the battle and died heroically alongside his loyal soldiers, fulfilling his duty to his homeland until the very end. The Ottomans captured Constantinople, and Mehmed II personally entered the city, triumphantly seated on his horse. The first place he headed was the magnificent Hagia Sophia, the Byzantine Empire's grand cathedral, renowned for its splendor and beauty. There he paused, gazing in awe at the stunning mosaics that adorned the walls and dome of the cathedral, and ordered that the church be immediately converted into a mosque. This moment became a symbol of the end of the Byzantine Empire and the birth of a new great power that would play a vital role in world history. After the conquest, Constantinople was renamed Istanbul and became the new capital of the Ottoman Empire. Mehmed actively began rebuilding the city, repopulating it with new residents, constructing mosques, markets, and lavish palaces, transforming it into one of the most beautiful and prosperous cities in the world. Constantinople, which had been the capital of the Byzantine Empire for centuries, now became the heart of the Ottoman Empire, the center of its political, economic, and cultural life. Following the conquest of Constantinople and the Ottoman Empire's rise to prominence as a major world power, its territory continued to grow steadily. The Ottomans consolidated their power in Anatolia, subjugated the Balkan Peninsula, and conquered a significant portion of the Middle East and North Africa. However, despite these impressive military successes, each new sultan had to prove his strength and right to the throne anew. Ottoman rulers could not afford to show weakness, as this could lead to unpredictable consequences. The struggle for the throne was always fierce and merciless, and the sultan's position depended not only on his power and wealth, but also on military victories on the battlefields, which strengthened his authority and instilled fear in his enemies. It was in such a complex and tense environment that the future great Sultan Suleiman was born in the early 16th century, destined to go down in history as one of the most powerful and outstanding rulers of the Ottoman Empire. Suleiman I was born in 1494 in Trabzon to Sultan Selim I. His father was a rigid and uncompromising ruler who came to power after ruthlessly eliminating his brothers and nephews to avoid a potential struggle for the throne. In his youth, Suleiman received a magnificent education, studying Islamic law, military affairs, literature, philosophy, and mastering several foreign languages. Unlike many other Ottoman rulers, he loved books and patronized science and the arts, gathering talented scholars, poets, and artists around him. However, in the Ottoman Empire, knowledge alone was not enough to become a successful ruler. The Sultan had to be first and foremost a warrior, capable of leading his troops into battle and achieving victories over his enemies. At the age of 16, Suleiman became governor of the province of Manisa, where he gained valuable experience in governing the state and learned the intricacies of political life. In 1520, Selim I passed away, and Suleiman became the new Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. Unlike his father, who seized power through a fierce struggle, his accession to the throne was relatively peaceful. He was the only claimant to the throne, and his position was strong enough to avoid open conflict. However, at the very beginning of his reign, He had to suppress several rebellions and then demonstrate his military strength to earn the respect of the janissaries and courtiers who could pose a threat to his power. Thus began a new era in the history of the Ottoman Empire, which brought it the greatest power and glory. From the outset, Suleiman proved himself to be not only a talented military leader, but also a visionary statesman, capable of solving complex political and economic problems. He continued the policy of conquest, expanding the borders of the empire, but also carried out large-scale reforms aimed at strengthening the internal structure of the state and improving the efficiency of government. His reign became a time of flourishing for the Ottoman Empire, which historians call the Golden Age. His military campaigns began with a march into Europe, where he planned to expand his influence and establish control over new territories. In 1521, he captured Belgrade, opening the way for the Ottomans into Central Europe and creating a springboard for further advance to the west. 5 years later, he inflicted a crushing defeat on the Hungarian army at the Battle of Mohacs, which became one of the most significant victories in his military career. Ottoman cavalry overwhelmed the Hungarian forces, and the Danube River became the final frontier, where a large part of the Hungarian army perished. After this battle, most of Hungary came under Ottoman control, and the Hungarian kingdom became a vassal of the Ottoman Sultan. However, Suleiman's main adversary was the Holy Roman Empire, led by Charles V, which posed a serious threat to Ottoman expansion in Europe. The Ottomans sought to advance deeper into Europe, but Austria stood in their way, and it needed to be broken. In 1529, the Ottoman army besieged Vienna, the capital of Austria, but failed to take it by storm. The onset of winter, lack of food, and powerful fortress walls made the Austrian defense virtually impregnable. Despite this unsuccessful assault, all of Europe realized that the Ottoman Empire was the main military power of its time, which had to be reckoned with. Suleiman did not limit himself to European wars. He conducted successful military campaigns against Persia, expanded the influence of the Ottoman Empire in North Africa, establishing control over important trade routes and strategic territories. In 1522, the Ottoman fleet captured Rhodes from the Knights Hospitaller, and in 1541, Algeria officially became an Ottoman province. The Ottoman Admiral Barbarossa, whose name struck terror into Europeans and aroused admiration among the Ottomans, ensured the dominance of the Ottoman Empire in the Mediterranean Sea. Khayr ad-Din Barbarossa was an outstanding man, a genius of naval warfare, a pirate, a conqueror of the Mediterranean. He turned the Ottoman fleet into the most formidable force of its time, capable of crushing any opponent. Barbarossa was born at the end of the 15th century on the island of Lesbos, in a family of a Greek or Albanian who had converted to Islam. He had 3 brothers, and from youth they chose a life full of risk and gain, becoming pirates, ploughing the expanses of the Mediterranean Sea. Attacking merchant ships, seizing booty, fierce battles with the Spanish and Italians. This was their way of life, a source of income, and a way to show their strength. 2 brothers, Arouj and Khayr ad-Din, quickly became famous throughout the Mediterranean for their daring and successful pirate operations. Because of the reddish color of their beards, they were nicknamed Barbarossas, which translates from Italian as red beard. Arouj was the first to think about ceasing to be a simple pirate and becoming a real ruler, possessing his own territory and power. In 1516, he captured Algiers and proclaimed himself its ruler, challenging the European powers seeking to control North Africa. However, the Europeans could not accept the emergence of such a threat in close proximity to their borders. The Spanish organized a military campaign to regain control of Algiers, and in 1518, Arouj died in battle, fighting against Spanish troops. Khayr ad-Din took his place, understanding that piracy alone was not enough to maintain power in Algiers. He then made a bold move that would radically change his life. He offered Sultan Selim I to make Algiers part of the Ottoman Empire, recognizing the Sultan's supreme authority. In exchange, he would receive the support of the most powerful state of his time, which would protect him from the European powers. The Sultan agreed to Barbarossa's proposal, seeing it as an opportunity to expand his influence in North Africa and strengthen the Ottoman Empire's position in the Mediterranean. In 1519, Barbarossa became the official representative of the Ottoman Empire in North Africa and the supreme admiral of its fleet. Now, he did not just attack ships, but commanded entire squadrons, had Ottoman troops at his disposal, and conquered cities, expanding the borders of the Ottoman Empire. In 1534, he captured Tunis, but within a year, the city was recaptured by the troops of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, who sought to restore his influence in North Africa. In response, Barbarossa unleashed a reign of terror in the Mediterranean, venting his anger on the European powers. His ships attacked Genoa, Venice, and the French and Spanish coasts, plundering cities and taking thousands of people captive, striking terror into the hearts of Europeans. Europe did not know how to stop Barbarossa, who seemed invincible. But Barbarossa's main triumph was the Battle of Preveza in 1538, which became one of the most significant naval battles in the history of the Mediterranean. Christian countries, realizing the threat posed by Barbarossa, joined forces, assembling a powerful fleet to end Ottoman dominance in the Mediterranean once and for all. Venice, Spain, Genoa, and the Knights of Malta sent dozens of their best ships. The united fleet was commanded by the famous Admiral Andrea Doria, who was considered invincible and enjoyed immense authority among European sailors. But even he proved powerless against Barbarossa's genius. The Ottoman fleet under Barbarossa's command routed the Christian squadron, and Barbarossa became the de facto master of the Mediterranean. The Ottoman admiral used cunning tactics, luring the enemy into a trap and crushing them, destroying or capturing dozens of ships. This battle forever changed the balance of power in the Mediterranean, which for many years became the domain of the Ottoman Empire. After this victory, Barbarossa became the most influential person in the Ottoman fleet, and his opinion was taken into account when making important decisions. His name was known even in the most remote corners of Europe, where he was feared and respected at the same time. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent trusted him like no other and highly valued his advice and experience. Barbarossa created a powerful system of control over sea lanes, ensuring the security of Ottoman trade and preventing European ships from freely sailing in the Mediterranean. The pirate fleets of North Africa became part of the Ottoman army, and his ships reigned supreme in the Mediterranean, striking fear into the enemies of the Ottoman Empire. When he retired, he did not have to hide or escape from enemies, as was often the case with other famous pirates. He triumphantly returned to Istanbul, where he lived in luxury and honor, remaining an advisor to the Sultan and influencing the politics of the Ottoman Empire. He died in 1546, leaving behind a tremendous legacy that outlived him for centuries. If the fate of borders was decided on the battlefields, then the fate of power itself was decided within the walls of Topkapi, the main palace of that time. The Ottoman sultans were absolute rulers, but not all decisions were made solely by them. Behind the scenes of politics hid another influential center of power, the harem. It was there that future sultans were raised, political alliances were formed, and the most influential women could effectively rule the state, exerting a tremendous influence on the politics of the Ottoman Empire. And one of those who changed the course of Ottoman history was Roxolana, also known as Hürrem Sultan, a woman who managed to win the heart of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent and become one of the most influential figures in the Ottoman Empire. The harem of the Ottoman Empire, contrary to popular belief, was not just a luxurious palace filled with beautiful women, but a complex and intricate world of intrigue, power struggles, and subtle politics, where decisions were made behind closed doors that determined the fates of rulers and the entire state. Women who entered the harem were given a unique chance not only to become the Sultan's favorites, but also to achieve great influence if they managed to conquer his heart and win his trust. However, to do this, they needed to possess not only external beauty, but also a sharp mind, cunning, political flair, and the ability to weave intrigues. And one of the most outstanding and influential women in the history of the Ottoman Empire was Roxolana, better known as Hürrem Sultan. She was born in the first half of the 16th century in the lands of modern Ukraine, which were part of the Polish kingdom. Her real name, in all likelihood, was Anastasia or Alexandra Lisovska. At a young age, she was captured by Crimean Tatars, who raided Ukrainian lands, and they sold her into slavery. After that, she ended up in the Ottoman harem, where a new life awaited her, full of surprises and dangers. In those days, many girls from Eastern Europe ended up in the Sultan's harem, but only a few managed to achieve power and influence. Roxolana did not just become one of the favorites of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. She managed to change the course of Ottoman history, exerting a tremendous influence on the politics of the state. From the very beginning, she stood out among the other concubines with her sharp mind, lively and cheerful character, and ability to charm those around her. It was for her cheerful disposition and ability to bring joy that she was given the name Hürrem, which in Persian means joyful or smiling. However, behind her apparent ease and carefree nature hid a sharp mind, incredible ambition, and a firm will. She managed not only to become the Sultan's main favorite, but also his legal wife, which was an unprecedented case for the Ottoman Empire, violating centuries-old traditions. Before her, no concubine had become the Sultan's official spouse, as Ottoman rulers avoided entering into marriages, fearing that this could give women too much political influence and lead to the destabilization of power. However, Suleiman was so attached to Hürrem that he decided to break traditions and go against public opinion. He officially married her and also allowed her to stay in Istanbul, in the Topkapi Palace, instead of sending her to the Old Palace, as was customary for the mothers of heirs after they reached a certain age. This gave Hürrem enormous influence, because now she was constantly at the center of the empire's political life, having the opportunity to influence decisions. Hürrem began to play an active role in state affairs, influencing the domestic and foreign policy of the Ottoman Empire. She corresponded with foreign rulers, including the Polish king, the Austrian Habsburgs, and even the Pope, demonstrating her high intelligence and diplomatic skills. Her letters are full of diplomatic subtleties, which testifies to her high level of education and deep understanding of world politics. However, the main field of her activity was the internal policy of the empire, where she skillfully wove intrigues and eliminated her rivals, strengthening her position at court. Her main opponent was the Grand Vizier Ibrahim Pasha, Sultan Suleiman's closest friend and advisor, who enjoyed immense influence and trust. Ibrahim Pasha had a great influence on the politics of the state and could hinder Hürrem's plans to strengthen her power. In 1536, Ibrahim Pasha was executed by order of the Sultan, and many historians believe that it was Hürrem who played a key role in his downfall, skillfully turning the Sultan against his loyal friend. But Hürrem's most important achievement was that she secured the throne for her son Selim. In Ottoman tradition, the heir was not the Sultan's eldest son, but the one who proved to be stronger and could prove his right to power. Often, after the Sultan's death, a fierce struggle for the throne began between his sons, in which the losers perished. The main rival of Hürrem's son, Selim, was Mustafa, Suleiman's eldest son from another concubine. Mustafa was a talented commander and enjoyed great popularity in the army, and he was considered the ideal heir to the throne. However, Hürrem did everything possible to get rid of him, using intrigue and slander. She spread rumors that Mustafa was allegedly plotting against Suleiman, planning to overthrow him from the throne. In 1553, the Sultan, believing these false accusations, ordered the execution of his son Mustafa, depriving him of his life and the opportunity to take the throne. After that, the path to power for Hurrem's son was open. When Suleiman died, it was Selim II who took the Ottoman throne. Although he did not have outstanding abilities and was a weak ruler, for Hurrem the main thing was achieved. Her descendants continued the dynasty, ensuring her influence on the future of the Ottoman Empire. In addition to political intrigues, Hurrem made a great contribution to the development of culture and charity. She built mosques, hospitals, bathhouses, organized assistance to the poor and needy, providing support to those who needed it. Her influence was felt not only in the palace, but also far beyond its borders. Hurrem died in 1558, 8 years before the death of Suleiman the Magnificent, leaving behind a bright mark in the history of the Ottoman Empire. She became the first woman in the history of the Ottoman Empire to be honored with burial next to the Sultan in his mausoleum, located on the territory of the Suleymaniye Mosque, which was another testament to her enormous influence and recognition of her services to the state. After the death of Hurrem Sultan, the influence of women in the harem continued to grow, and soon an era began that historians call the Sultanate of Women, when the mothers and wives of sultans, being behind the scenes of power, actually ruled the state, exerting a tremendous influence on the politics of the Ottoman Empire. The story of Hurrem Sultan is an amazing story of how a woman who entered the harem as a slave managed, thanks to her mind, cunning and foresight, to become one of the most influential figures in the history of the Ottoman Empire, leaving an indelible mark on its culture and politics. Her wit, cunning and foresight allowed her to leave a lasting mark on history, and her descendants ruled the empire for many decades, continuing her policies and strengthening the power of the Ottoman Empire. Beyond conquests, Suleiman the Magnificent left behind something more enduring than military victories and the expansion of state borders. He understood that the true power of a ruler is measured not only by the size of his empire, but also by what he creates for future generations, what values he instills in his people, and what legacy he leaves behind. That is why his reign ushered in an era of flourishing architecture that had a tremendous impact on the development of art and culture in the Ottoman Empire, and the main creator of this era was an architect whose name was forever etched in history, Mimar Sinan. Sinan was born at the end of the 15th century into a Christian family in the territory of the Ottoman Empire, most likely in Anatolia, which was part of the Ottoman Empire. In his youth, he was taken into the Janissaries, the Sultan's elite troops, where he received military education and mastered various military skills. However, instead of becoming a warrior and gaining fame on the battlefields, he displayed exceptional engineering and architectural abilities, which were noticed by the Sultan's officials. In military campaigns, he built bridges, fortresses, aqueducts, and other engineering structures, demonstrating his talent and ability to solve complex technical problems, and soon his outstanding abilities were noticed by Sultan Suleiman himself. Suleiman, appreciating Sinan's talent, appointed him chief architect of the empire, and from that moment on, his great career began, which brought him worldwide fame and recognition. Suleiman set Sinan an ambitious task to create architectural masterpieces that would not only glorify the Ottoman Empire throughout the world, but also surpass everything that existed before, captivating with their grandeur and beauty. The Sultan dreamed of structures that could rival the grandeur of the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, symbolizing the power and greatness of the Ottoman Empire. Sinan's first major project was the Shehzade Mosque in Istanbul, built in memory of the Sultan's early deceased son, which became a symbol of the Sultan's grief and love for his son. Although this mosque was already recognized as a masterpiece of architectural art, the architect Sinan himself modestly considered it his apprentice work, the first step towards creating more perfect and magnificent structures. The real flowering of his talent came with the construction of the Suleymaniye Mosque, one of the most grandiose structures of the Ottoman Empire, which became a symbol of the power and prosperity of the Ottoman Empire during the reign of Suleiman the Magnificent. The Suleymaniye Mosque was an entire complex of buildings, including madrasas, hospitals, libraries, caravanserais, and bathhouses, making it not only a religious but also a cultural and social center of Istanbul. Its enormous dome, towering over the city, created a sense of power and harmony, and the engineering solutions used by Sinan in the construction of the mosque made it incredibly strong and resistant to various natural disasters. Sinan used innovative construction methods that allowed the building to withstand earthquakes and other natural disasters, which was especially important for Istanbul, located in a seismically active zone. However, his greatest work was the Selimiye Mosque in Edirne, built under Suleiman's son, Selim II, which is considered the pinnacle of Sinan's architectural creativity. The dome of the Selimiye Mosque was even larger than the dome of the Hagia Sophia, which became a real architectural triumph of the Ottoman Empire and proof of the superiority of Ottoman architecture over Byzantine architecture. In his long and fruitful life, Sinan built more than 300 buildings for various purposes: mosques, palaces, bridges, bathhouses, and aqueducts, leaving behind a huge architectural legacy. He transformed Ottoman architecture into a true art, creating a unique style that combined Byzantine, Persian, and Arab elements, and leaving a legacy that continues to inspire to this day, being one of the main symbols of the Ottoman Empire. Suleiman the Magnificent perfectly understood that the glory of a conqueror may fade over time, but stone remains eternal, serving as a reminder of the greatness of the ruler and his era. Thanks to the union of the Sultan and the talented architect Sinan, buildings appeared in the heart of the Ottoman Empire that have survived the centuries and still symbolize its former greatness, being the pride of the Turkish people. After the death of Suleiman the Magnificent, the Ottoman Empire continued to expand, but inside the Topkapi Palace, another battle was raging, no less bloody and cruel than the wars with the Europeans and Persians. The struggle for power was waged not only between viziers and military leaders, but also in the very heart of the empire, in the harem, where intrigues were woven and the fates of rulers were decided. The harem was a hidden battlefield where conspiracies were hatched, rivals were destroyed, and the future of the empire depended on women whose influence remained in the shadows, but was enormous and all-encompassing. The harem was a unique center of Ottoman politics, where the mothers of sultans and concubines, who had a huge influence on their sons, ruled the state from behind the scenes, directing the politics of the empire in the direction they needed. The Ottoman tradition did not provide for a strict order of succession to the throne. Unlike European monarchies, where the throne automatically passed to the king's eldest son in the Ottoman Empire, the ruler became not the one who was born first, but the one who was stronger and managed to seize and hold power, killing his rivals. This meant that the sultan's sons, born from different mothers, became enemies from the moment of their birth, and their lives were filled with constant fear and struggle for survival. Their fates were decided not only on the battlefields, where their sons could show their courage and valor, but also in the dark corridors of the Topkapi Palace, where the harem was the center of political intrigue and complex games that determined the future of the Ottoman Empire. The concubines who gave birth to the sultan's sons understood perfectly well that their lives depended entirely on the success and prosperity of their children, and that in the event of their defeat, they would lose everything, including their lives. If their son lost in the struggle for the throne, he died. And with him, his mother lost power and influence, who could become a victim of palace intrigues and the machinations of her rivals. To survive in this cruel world and secure the future for their children, the women of the harem used all available means. They wove intrigues, created spy networks, bribed influential officials, and in some cases even resorted to murdering their enemies. The harem became an arena of fierce struggle for the throne, where the future of the entire Ottoman Empire depended on who would be the shrewdest, smartest, and most ruthless in this merciless game. Sultanas gained particular influence on the politics of the Ottoman Empire during the era that historians call the Sultanate of Women, a period when the mothers and wives of the sultans actually ruled the Ottoman Empire, using the harem as their main instrument of power and influence. These women controlled the appointment of state viziers, eliminated political enemies, concluded alliances with foreign powers, and made decisions that determined the fate of the country and its people. Some of them ruled openly as official regents for their minor sons, others acted secretly through their sons, but all of them turned the harem into a real political center from which the huge empire was ruled. One of the most cruel customs of the Ottoman court was the practice of fratricide, which was used to prevent the struggle for power and maintain stability in the state. The new sultan, in order to avoid potential revolts and maintain his power, often ordered the execution of all his brothers, depriving them of the opportunity to claim the throne. This was not an expression of cruelty for the sake of cruelty. It was a measure dictated by the harsh reality of the political life of the Ottoman Empire. There was no stable system of succession to the throne in the Ottoman Empire, and each son of the Sultan had the right to assert his rights to the throne, which often led to bloody internecine wars. If at least one of the princes remained alive, he could become the center of a conspiracy and overthrow his brother, which created a constant threat to the ruling sultan. This custom became especially entrenched after the death of Suleiman the Magnificent, when his son Selim II took the throne without a fight, but in the following decades, fratricide became common practice. Young princes who could claim the throne were strangled with a silk cord, which was considered an honorable death, since Ottoman laws forbade shedding the blood of members of the ruling family in order to avoid a curse. Sometimes specially trained deaf-mute executioners were used for this purpose to avoid information leakage and keep the execution secret. But even despite these harsh measures, conspiracies did not cease, and many sultans lived in constant fear for their lives, knowing that there could be a traitor among their inner circle, ready to betray them and overthrow them from the throne. Viziers, generals, courtiers, all could become part of palace intrigues, and the dissatisfied forces in the empire were always looking for a way to put a more convenient and manageable candidate on the throne. Among the many women who left a lasting mark on the history of the Ottoman Empire, Kösem Sultan stands out, possessing exceptional political talent and managing to achieve enormous power. She not only ruled the country through her son, but also actually controlled the entire Ottoman Empire for several decades, exerting a huge influence on its politics and economy. Kösem was of Greek origin and entered the harem of Sultan Ahmed I, where she managed to win his heart and become his main favorite. She quickly won the Sultan's favor and gave birth to several sons, which strengthened her position at court. However, her path to power began after the death of Sultan Ahmed, when she showed her political genius and managed to maintain her influence, despite the changes at court. Unlike many other concubines who lost their influence after the death of their patrons, Kösem managed to maintain her power and rule the state through her children and grandchildren, exerting a huge influence on the politics of the Ottoman Empire. When her son, Murad IV, ascended the Ottoman throne, he was still a child, and Kösem became regent, effectively ruling the country in his name and making all important state decisions. Her power was not limited to palace intrigues. She also controlled the appointment of viziers, formed alliances with foreign states, and eliminated her political rivals, consolidating her position in power. But her greatest influence manifested after the death of Murad IV, when her other son, Ibrahim I, ascended the throne. This sultan was weak and mentally unstable, which allowed Kösem to rule the state almost single-handedly, making all important decisions and controlling all aspects of life in the Ottoman Empire. However, his unpredictable behavior and eccentric actions led to a coup. He was overthrown and executed, and Kösem again found herself at the center of a fierce power struggle. When her grandson, Mehmed IV, ascended the throne, Kösem once again became regent, gaining the opportunity to rule the country in his name. Now, she controlled not only the state, but also the entire dynasty, determining the future of the Ottoman Empire. She eliminated her enemies with a single word. Her orders were carried out unquestioningly, and viziers and emirs understood that disobeying her meant signing their own death warrants. They feared her more than the Sultan himself. But even the most powerful woman in the empire could not rule forever, and in 1651, Kösem Sultan was killed on the orders of her daughter-in-law, Turhan Sultan, who decided to get rid of her overly influential mother-in-law in order to rule the empire independently, sharing power with no one. The story of Kösem Sultan is a vivid example that power in the Ottoman Empire belonged not only to the sultans, but also to women who, thanks to their intelligence and cunning, could exert a huge influence on the politics of the state. The harem was not just a place for the ruler's entertainment, but a real political center where the fates of the empire were decided, intrigues were woven, and decisions were made that determined the future of the Ottoman Empire. After a period of great conquests and stable rule that lasted for centuries, the Ottoman Empire gradually changed, entering a period of decline. Sultans less and less often personally governed the state, entrusting power to grand viziers, who became the actual rulers of the Ottoman Empire. These men controlled the finances of the state, commanded the army, determined foreign policy, and were responsible for internal order in the country. They decided which wars to wage, with whom to form alliances, and whom to execute, concentrating enormous power in their hands. Sometimes their influence was so great that the sultans became only nominal rulers, and all key decisions were made by the viziers, who determined the fate of the Ottoman Empire. While the sultans amused themselves in the harem or indulged in hunting and other pleasures, it was the grand viziers who ruled the vast empire, determining its political course and exerting a huge influence on its future. One of the most outstanding grand viziers in the history of the Ottoman Empire was Mehmed Köprülü, who managed to restore order in the country and strengthen its position in the international arena. In the mid-17th century, the Ottoman Empire was going through hard times, facing serious internal and external problems. In the empire's capital, Istanbul, uprisings of the Janissaries flared up, demanding higher salaries and expanded privileges. Officials were mired in corruption, embezzling public funds and profiting from the needs of ordinary people. European countries were reclaiming land from the Ottoman Empire, weakening its influence in Europe. Sultans changed one after another, not having time to restore order in the country and solve the accumulated problems. Viziers came and went, but none of them could stop the chaos and restore stability to the Ottoman Empire. In 1656, the ruling Sultan Mehmed IV offered the post of Grand Vizier to Köprülü Mehmed Pasha, an experienced but tough man who was famous for his inflexibility and ability to restore order. He agreed to accept this position, but made a condition to the Sultan: to grant him complete freedom of action and not to interfere in his decisions. The Sultan had no choice but to agree to this condition, and Köprülü Mehmed Pasha began to act decisively. First of all, he restored order in the army, brutally cracking down on the rebellious Janissaries who posed a serious threat to the stability of the state. Any attempts at rebellion were suppressed with extreme cruelty. Hundreds of rebels were executed, and those who survived were sent to the most remote borders of the empire so that they could no longer cause trouble. Then he took up the fight against corruption. Dozens of officials who had profited from the state treasury were sent into exile or executed on his orders. Köprülü Mehmed Pasha regained control over the provinces, restored discipline in the army, and began a military campaign to reclaim lost territories, restoring the power of the Ottoman Empire. In 1669, the Ottomans defeated the Venetian fleet and captured the island of Euboea, concluding the Cretan War in their favor and strengthening their influence in the Mediterranean. Köprülü Mehmed Pasha managed to stabilize the situation in the empire, and after his death, the management of the state passed to his son, Fazıl Ahmed Köprülü, who continued his father's policy aimed at strengthening the power of the Ottoman Empire. The Köprülü dynasty actually ruled the empire for several decades, keeping the country from collapse and achieving military victories, which allowed the Ottoman Empire to maintain its influence in the region. However, not all viziers were successful, and some of them, through their mistakes and miscalculations, caused enormous harm to the Ottoman Empire. One of the most famous examples of such unsuccessful rule was the Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa, whose unsuccessful siege of Vienna in 1683 fundamentally changed the course of the history of the Ottoman Empire and marked the beginning of its decline. At that time, the Ottomans still maintained control over the Balkans and sought to advance further into Europe, expanding their possessions and spreading their influence. Kara Mustafa decided that the best way to strengthen Ottoman influence in Europe would be to conquer Vienna, a key city that opened the way to Central Europe and allowed control of important trade routes. Under his command, a huge Ottoman army, numbering more than 150,000 soldiers, set out on a campaign to Vienna, intending to capture the city and establish Ottoman dominance in the region. After several weeks of marching, Ottoman troops surrounded Vienna, preparing for the assault. The city's defenders were far fewer than the Ottoman soldiers, and it seemed that Vienna would not be able to withstand the onslaught of the powerful Ottoman army for long. However, Kara Mustafa made a fatal mistake, refusing to immediately storm the city and deciding to take Vienna by attrition, hoping that a prolonged siege would lead to the exhaustion of the defenders and force them to surrender without a fight. He believed that over time, the city's defenders would run out of food supplies, famine would begin, and the city would fall without serious resistance from the Ottoman army. However, this plan turned out to be flawed and led to catastrophic consequences. While the Ottomans waited, hoping for Vienna's early capitulation, the Christian states mobilized their forces to assist the besieged city. Austrians and Poles gathered a powerful army, and at its head stood the Polish King Jan III Sobieski, an outstanding commander and national hero of Poland. When the Allied forces approached the Ottoman camp, Kara Mustafa still hoped to maintain the siege of Vienna, but the enemies unexpectedly attacked first, inflicting a crushing blow on the Ottoman army. At the crucial moment of the battle, the Polish cavalry, the famous winged hussars, crashed into the Ottoman ranks, breaking through the defense and forcing the Ottoman army to flee in panic. The Ottoman army was defeated, thousands of soldiers died, and the troops retreated in panic, leaving behind all their supplies and artillery on the battlefield. The defeat at Vienna was a real disaster for the Ottoman Empire. Until that moment, the Ottomans were considered the main military force in Europe, but now their expansion was stopped, and the European countries launched a counter-offensive, seeking to regain lost territories. Soon, the Ottomans had to leave Hungary and Transylvania, losing control over these strategically important regions. After returning to Istanbul, Kara Mustafa was summoned to the palace, where he was met with severe punishment for the mistake he had made. The defeat was so serious that Sultan Mehmed IV ordered the execution of the Grand Vizier, holding him responsible for the failure of the military campaign. Kara Mustafa was strangled with a silk cord, which was a traditional method of execution for high-ranking Ottoman officials who had committed serious crimes against the state. The Grand Viziers of the Ottoman Empire determined its successes and failures, its ups and downs. Some, such as Mehmed Köprülü, saved the state from chaos and strengthened its position in the international arena. while others, such as Kara Mustafa, made fatal mistakes that cost the empire its power and influence, leading to the loss of territories and the weakening of the power of the Ottoman Empire. The defeat at Vienna was the first serious blow to Ottoman power, but the war with Europe was only one side of the problem facing the Ottoman Empire. While the Ottomans were losing their positions in the Balkans, a new threat was emerging in the north, which would play an important role in the weakening of the Ottoman Empire in the future. For centuries, the Ottoman Empire dominated the Black Sea region, controlling strategically important Crimea and keeping the Russian lands isolated from the southern seas, preventing them from developing trade and strengthening their position in the region. However, at the end of the 17th century, a new state emerged on the historical stage, which was rapidly gaining strength and posed a serious threat to the Ottoman Empire: Russia. Until this point, Russia had not played a significant role in wars against the Ottomans, and its influence in the region was negligible. The Muscovite princes and Russian czars periodically clashed with the Crimean Khanate, a vassal of the Ottoman Empire, but could not withstand its raids or stop the devastating campaigns of the Crimean Tatars. For centuries, the Crimean Tatars carried out destructive raids on the southern lands of Russia, driving tens of thousands of people into captivity and causing enormous damage to the Russian economy. The Ottomans used Crimea as a tool to exert pressure on Russia, maintaining their dominance in the region and preventing Russia from strengthening its position in the Black Sea region. Everything changed when Peter I, an energetic and far-sighted ruler determined to transform Russia into a great power, came to power in Russia. Peter I saw the Ottoman Empire as the main rival, preventing Russia from reaching the southern seas and establishing itself in the Black Sea region. He understood that without control over the Black Sea, Russia would remain cut off from world trade and unable to compete with European powers, which would negatively affect its development. The Ottomans and their allies in Crimea completely blockaded Russia's southern borders, preventing trade through its ports and causing enormous damage to the Russian economy. For Russia, this was a serious strategic challenge that required an immediate solution and forced Peter I to look for ways to access the southern seas. In 1689, the Russian army launched its first major campaign against the Crimean Khanate, demonstrating its strength and intention to strengthen its position in the region. Peter sent troops deep into Crimea, but encountered serious difficulties due to the geographical features of the peninsula and the Crimean Tatars' tactics. The Crimeans, possessing a mobile cavalry, did not engage in open battles with the Russian troops, but used a scorched earth policy, burning food supplies and retreating deep into the peninsula, luring the Russian troops into a trap. The Russian troops found themselves in a deserted steppe without sufficient provisions and water, forcing them to retreat with significant losses. Despite the failure, the very fact that Russian troops invaded Crimea showed that Russia was now a serious threat to Ottoman positions in the region, and that the Ottoman Empire would have to reckon with its interests. At the beginning of the 18th century, Peter I continued his offensive in the southern direction, seeking to gain Russia's access to the Black Sea. In 1711, he undertook the Prut campaign against the Ottoman Empire, hoping to defeat the Turkish army and establish a foothold in the Black Sea region. Russian troops entered the territory of modern Moldova, but were surrounded by superior Ottoman forces, finding themselves in a very difficult situation. It seemed that Russia would suffer a crushing defeat, but Peter I showed diplomatic talent and was able to negotiate peace with the Ottomans, promising to hand over the fortress of Azov, which had been conquered by Russian troops earlier. This temporarily halted the war between Russia and the Ottoman Empire, but it did not change Russia's strategic plans to reach the southern seas and strengthen its position in the region. Peter I made it clear that the struggle for access to the southern seas was only just beginning, and that Russia would not abandon its plans despite temporary setbacks. The real blow to Ottoman positions in the Black Sea region was struck under Catherine II, who continued Peter I's policy of expanding Russian possessions in the south. Unlike Peter, who only laid the foundations for expansion in the Black Sea region, Catherine not only challenged the Ottoman Empire, but also inflicted one of the most severe defeats in its history, forever changing the balance of power in the region. In 1768, a new war began between Russia and the Ottoman Empire, which ended in the complete defeat of the Turkish army and a significant weakening of the Ottoman Empire's position in the Black Sea region. The Russian armies inflicted a series of heavy defeats on the Ottomans, capturing key fortresses on the Danube and in Crimea, demonstrating their military superiority. In 1774, the Treaty of Küçük was signed, under which the Ottoman Empire was forced to recognize the independence of the Crimean Khanate, which was a huge blow to Ottoman prestige and put an end to Ottoman dominance in Crimea. This meant that Crimea was no longer a vassal of the Ottoman Empire and could enter into alliances with Russia or other states at its discretion. The Ottomans hoped that an independent Crimea would remain in their sphere of influence, but in 1783, Russia finally annexed the peninsula, incorporating it into the Russian Empire and establishing control over the entire Black Sea region. The Crimean Tatars, weakened by internal conflicts and unable to organize effective resistance, could not stop the Russian expansion, and the Russian army occupied Simferopol and other key cities of the peninsula without a fight, establishing control over the entire territory of Crimea. This was a devastating blow to the Ottoman Empire, which lost control over the entire northern part of the Black Sea, losing an important strategic region. For the Ottomans, the loss of Crimea was not just a military defeat, but also a serious challenge to their status as a great power claiming dominance in the region. The Ottomans had always considered themselves defenders of Islam, and the loss of Crimea, where a Muslim population lived, was a serious blow to the Sultan's prestige, undermining his authority in the Muslim world. In response to Russia's annexation of Crimea, the Sultan declared a perpetual jihad against Russia, calling on all Muslims of the empire to fight for the return of Crimea under Ottoman rule. However, this declaration could no longer change the situation, and the Ottoman Empire did not have sufficient forces to regain Crimea by force. The Ottoman Empire was no longer the formidable power capable of stopping Russia's expansion and reclaiming lost territories. After the annexation of Crimea, Russia gained unimpeded access to the Black Sea, built new fortresses and naval bases along the coast, and its fleet began to dominate the region, depriving the Ottoman fleet of the ability to control the Black Sea. The Ottomans, having lost Crimea, were on the defensive, and their influence in Europe and the Balkans continued to decline steadily, giving way to Russia's growing influence. The strategic initiative now passed entirely to Russia, which in the following decades continued to push the Ottomans out of their territories, expanding its possessions and strengthening its position in the region. The loss of Crimea became a symbol of the weakening of the Ottoman Empire and the beginning of its long decline, predetermining its future fate. By the beginning of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire was no longer the formidable force that had once conquered Constantinople, crushed Persia, and besieged Vienna, terrifying all of Europe. Its numerous defeats in wars with Russia and other European powers clearly showed that the empire was no longer able to compete with the new, strong, and developed states that had entered the historical arena. The Ottoman troops, who had previously struck terror into European armies, now suffered frequent defeats in battles, yielding to the enemy in weaponry, training, and tactics. The economy of the Ottoman Empire was in decline, the central government was weakening, and the empire was increasingly lagging behind the developed countries of Europe. European diplomats increasingly referred to the Ottoman Empire as the sick man of Europe, a power that was slowly fading away and awaiting its inevitable end, unable to adapt to the new conditions. The main problem of the Ottoman Empire was that it was stuck between the past and the future, unable to decisively break with outdated traditions and adapt to modern realities. On the one hand, Its rulers understood that without carrying out large-scale reforms, the country would collapse completely, and that it was necessary to modernize the army, the economy, and the system of government. But on the other hand, any attempt at renewal and reform met with fierce resistance from the old Ottoman elite, the conservative army, and influential religious leaders who were unwilling to give up their privileges and lose their influence. European states were developing rapidly, transitioning to an industrial economy, creating powerful armies equipped with modern weapons and introducing new technologies, while the Ottoman Empire remained a feudal power where much depended on the will of the Sultan and his inner circle, unable to compete effectively with the developed countries of Europe. In the 19th century, Ottoman rulers made several attempts to carry out large-scale reforms aimed at modernizing the country. One of the first steps was the Tanzimat movement, a series of reforms initiated by Sultans Mahmud II and Abdul-Mejid I, who sought to transform the Ottoman Empire into a modern state on the European model. Reforms were carried out in the army, the tax and judicial systems, the construction of railroads began, secular schools were created, and laws became more equitable for Muslims and non-Muslims, attempting to create a modern and secular state. However, all these reforms did not solve the main problem: the weakening of the central government, which could not effectively control the situation in the country and resist separatist tendencies in the provinces. The old Ottoman elites, including the Janissaries and religious leaders, fiercely resisted the reforms, unwilling to lose their privileges. Even in the army, despite modernization and the introduction of new military technologies, discipline remained weak, and officers often proved unprepared for modern warfare. At the same time, many provinces of the empire began to fall out of the control of the central government, seeking autonomy or complete independence. Greece, Serbia, and Romania gained independence from the Ottoman Empire. Egypt effectively ceased to obey the Sultan, and uprisings broke out more and more frequently in the Balkans, indicating instability in the region and the weakening of Ottoman influence. But the most serious threat to the Ottomans remained Russia, which continued its expansion to the south, seeking to seize control of the Black Sea Straits and establish its dominance in the Balkans. Starting in the 18th century, Russia waged constant wars with the Ottoman Empire, gradually pushing it out of the Balkan Peninsula and the Black Sea region, weakening its positions and seizing territories. In the 19th century, this process accelerated, and Russia became increasingly involved in the internal affairs of the Ottoman Empire, supporting the Christian population and inciting them to revolt. After Russia's victory in the Russo-Turkish War of 1828–29, the Ottomans were forced to recognize the independence of Greece, and the Russian fleet established control over the Black Sea, depriving the Ottoman Empire of the ability to control this vital region. However, Russia was not the only one seeking to divide Ottoman lands and weaken its position. England and France also saw the Ottoman Empire as a weakened rival whose territories could be used for their own interests, seeking to establish control over strategically important regions and rich resources. This was particularly evident in the Crimean War of 1853–56, when England and France unexpectedly became allies of the Ottomans against Russia to contain its expansion in the Black Sea region. The European powers did not want Russia to completely destroy the Ottoman Empire and establish complete control over the Balkans and the Black Sea Straits, so they decided to support Istanbul to maintain the balance of power in the region. As a result of the war, Russia was defeated and temporarily weakened its influence in the Balkans, but the Ottomans did not become stronger as a result, and their position in the region did not improve. The empire continued to descend into chaos, suffering from internal problems and external pressure. By the end of the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire had become a state that could no longer determine its own destiny, finding itself completely dependent on the European powers. The European powers controlled the economy of the Ottoman Empire, imposed their conditions on the sultans, and determined its policies, turning the Ottoman Empire into a semi-colony. Western countries invested huge amounts of money in the construction of Ottoman railroads, ports, and factories. But all these projects benefited investors rather than the Ottomans themselves, who received no benefit from them. Debts to European banks grew, and the Ottoman economy became increasingly dependent on the West, leading to the weakening of the state and the strengthening of the influence of the European powers. It was during this difficult time that the last great ruler of the Ottoman Empire, Sultan Abdul Hamid II, ascended the Ottoman throne, attempting to stop the impending catastrophe. He understood that the Ottoman Empire was on the verge of complete collapse and that decisive measures needed to be taken to save it from imminent destruction. Abdul Hamid II attempted to strengthen his power by establishing a strict autocracy and limiting the influence of the European powers on the internal politics of the Ottoman Empire. Abdul Hamid reversed liberal reforms, suppressed the opposition, established control over the press, and strengthened the influence of Islam in the administration of the state, seeking to consolidate society and strengthen his power. He hoped that uniting the Muslim part of the population around the Sultan as the Caliph of all Muslims would help preserve the empire and resist external pressure. One of his main steps was the construction of the Hejaz Railway, which was intended to connect Istanbul with the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, which would strengthen the connection between the center of the empire and its remote regions. It was not only an economic achievement, but also a symbol of the revival of Islamic power in the empire, demonstrating the power and greatness of the Ottoman Empire to the world. However, despite all the efforts of Abdul Hamid II, it was no longer possible to save the Ottoman Empire, and its disintegration was only a matter of time. Uprisings in the Balkans continued. The European powers increasingly interfered in the internal affairs of the Ottomans, and within the state itself, discontent with the Sultan's dictatorship was brewing, and the desire for democratic change was growing. In 1908, the Young Turks, a group of officers and politicians advocating modernization and democratic reforms, launched a rebellion and forced Abdul Hamid to restore the constitution that he had previously abolished, ending his authoritarian rule. A few years later, he was overthrown, and the Ottoman Empire entered the final stage of its existence, moving towards its inevitable collapse. The 19th century was a time of fierce struggle for survival for the Ottoman Empire as it tried to maintain its influence and resist external pressure. Despite attempts at reform, strengthening central power, and aid from Western countries, the empire continued to weaken, losing its territories and influence. Russia, England, and France divided the Ottoman lands among themselves, supported uprisings in the Balkans, and exploited its economic weakness for their own interests, weakening it and bringing it closer to its end. Attempts at modernization were either not deep and effective enough or met with fierce resistance within the country from conservative forces who did not want change. Abdul Hamid II was the last sultan who desperately tried to stop the collapse of the empire, but even his strict measures could not save the Ottoman state from its inevitable end, and it continued to move towards its doom. By the beginning of the 20th century, the Ottoman Empire was in a deep crisis, experiencing a period of political instability, economic decline, and territorial losses. The once great power that stretched from the Balkan Peninsula to the Middle East and North Africa was now just a weak remnant of its former power, unable to compete with the developed countries of Europe. Almost all European territories had been lost, the economy was falling apart, the army had long been unable to compete with the European powers, and political instability made the Sultan's position increasingly precarious and unstable. The Ottomans understood that a new global conflict was inevitable, and that in this war they would have to choose a side. But the choice of ally proved fatal for them, predetermining their tragic fate. They decided to bet on Germany, hoping that an alliance with a young, ambitious, and well-armed power would help them regain lost territories and restore the former glory of the Ottoman Empire. The choice of Germany was not accidental and was due to a number of factors. The Germans had been trying to gain a foothold in the Middle East for decades, investing huge amounts of money in Ottoman industry, railroad construction, and army modernization, seeking to establish their influence in the region. Berlin engineers were building a strategically important railroad from Europe to Baghdad, which was intended to connect Germany with the oil-rich regions of the Middle East, allowing the Ottomans to strengthen control over their eastern provinces and develop trade. German officers reformed the Ottoman army, supplying it with modern weapons and training soldiers in European tactics, seeking to turn the Ottoman army into an effective military force. In addition, the Ottomans were confident that an alliance with Germany would allow them to regain lost territories such as Egypt and the Balkans, and perhaps even Crimea, restoring the former greatness of the Ottoman Empire. But most of all, they were pushed into an alliance with Germany by hatred of their longtime enemies, Russia, Great Britain, and France, who made no secret of the fact that they considered the Ottoman Empire the sick man of Europe and were waiting for a convenient moment to divide its lands, establishing control over its rich resources and strategically important territories. When the First World War began, the Ottomans naively hoped for a quick victory for Germany and its allies, but the reality turned out to be much harsher and more brutal. In the first months of the war, it became clear that the Ottoman army was not sufficiently prepared for modern warfare. The supply of troops was poorly organized, and many generals were more concerned with political intrigues than with combat operations, which negatively affected the effectiveness of the army. The first serious test for the Ottomans was the Caucasus campaign against Russia, which turned into a real catastrophe for them. In the early winter of 1914, the Ottoman Minister of War, Enver Pasha, an ambitious and self-confident politician, sent tens of thousands of soldiers through the snowy mountain passes of the Caucasus, hoping to take revenge for past defeats and seize Russian territories with a sudden blow. But this adventure turned into a real tragedy for the Ottoman army. Severe frosts began in the mountains, soldiers died from cold and disease, and the Russians, taking advantage of their weakness and unpreparedness for warfare in winter conditions, struck a crushing blow at Sarikamish. The Ottoman army was almost completely destroyed, suffering huge losses in manpower and equipment, and this failure undermined faith in victory and weakened the position of the Ottoman Empire. In the West, the situation was no better for the Ottomans. Great Britain and France, seeking to assist Russia and withdraw the Ottoman Empire from the war, attempted to break through the Ottoman defenses in the area of the Bosporus and Dardanelles Straits in order to open the way to Russia through the Black Sea. Thus began the Dardanelles operation, one of the bloodiest and most fierce battles of the First World War. The Allies landed large forces on the Gallipoli Peninsula, counting on a quick victory and the capture of the straits, but the Ottomans were ready for defense and put up fierce resistance. A young officer, Mustafa Kemal, who at that time was little known outside the army, personally led the soldiers into battle and stopped the Allied offensive, showing outstanding military abilities and heroism. Despite the horrific losses on both sides, the British and French were unable to take the straits and were forced to retreat, suffering heavy losses. This was one of the few victories of the Ottoman Empire in the First World War, but it could not change the overall course of the war, and the situation for the Ottomans continued to deteriorate. While heavy and bloody battles continued on the fronts, discontent with the war was brewing inside the country, and the desire for change was growing. The Ottoman Empire was too large, too many peoples inhabited its territories, and not all of them were willing to die for the Sultan and his empire. This was especially true in the Arab provinces, which leaned towards independence and were unwilling to submit to Turkish rule. Great Britain skillfully exploited this situation and began to push the Arab tribes to revolt against the Ottoman Empire, promising them support in creating an independent Arab state. A rebellion erupted in the deserts of Arabia, led by Sharif Hussein bin Ali of Mecca, a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, who enjoyed immense authority among the Arabs. The British secretly supplied the rebels with weapons, sent military instructors, including the famous Lawrence of Arabia, who played an important role in organizing and coordinating the Arab revolt. The Arabs began to attack Ottoman garrisons, cut railways, and refused to obey orders from Istanbul, weakening the Ottoman army and hampering its supply lines. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, the Ottoman army suffered one defeat after another, losing control over territories and weakening its position in the region. Britain attacked Mesopotamia and Palestine, its troops captured Baghdad, and then entered Jerusalem, depriving the Ottoman Empire of control over these important cities. Eventually, enemy armies found themselves in Damascus, and the Ottomans could no longer organize serious resistance, as their army was exhausted, their morale undermined, and provinces were falling out of control one after another. In October of 1918, the Ottoman Empire was forced to sign a capitulation, acknowledging its defeat in World War I. It was the end of the war for the Ottomans, but not the end of their suffering, as difficult times and territorial losses awaited them. The Allies did not simply win the war. They began to divide the Ottoman lands, seeking to establish control over its territories and resources. France occupied Syria and Lebanon, Britain, Iraq and Palestine. Greece landed in Izmir, claiming part of the Turkish territories. Istanbul itself, the capital of the Ottoman Empire, was occupied by Allied forces. The Ottoman Empire officially no longer existed, and its future seemed bleak and hopeless. But there was a man who would not allow Turkey to disappear from the map of the world and managed to defend its independence in the struggle against external enemies. Mustafa Kemal, the hero of Gallipoli, refused to submit to the Allies and recognize their authority over Turkey, deciding to fight for its freedom and independence. Instead, he went deep into the country, gathered like-minded people around him, and declared that the struggle for the liberation of Turkey continued, and that the Turkish people would not accept the occupation. In 1919, he led the National Liberation Movement, organized a government in Ankara, and began the war for Turkish independence, managing to unite the Turkish people around him and inspire them to fight against the occupiers. The Turks supported Mustafa Kemal, unwilling to become a colony and lose their independence. When, in 1920, the Allies signed the Treaty of Sèvres, which effectively destroyed Turkey as an independent state, Mustafa Kemal refused to recognize it and declared that the Turkish people would never agree to such humiliating terms. He began a war with the Greeks, who had occupied Western Anatolia, and inflicted a crushing defeat on them, liberating Turkish lands from occupation. Then, Turkish troops drove the French out of the south of the country, and after that, Kemal turned his attention to occupied Istanbul, seeking to liberate it from Allied troops and restore Turkish sovereignty over the capital. In 1922, the Sultanate was officially abolished, marking the end of the era of the Ottoman sultans. The last sultan, Mehmed VI, realizing that his power was over, fled Istanbul on a British warship, seeking to avoid persecution and save his life. The Ottoman Empire ceased to exist, giving way to a new state. In 1923, Mustafa Kemal, who had become a national hero of Turkey, proclaimed the creation of the Turkish Republic, opening a new page in the country's history. He became its first president and carried out radical reforms aimed at modernizing and westernizing Turkey. Turkey was no longer an Ottoman monarchy based on religious principles. It became a secular state striving for progress and development. Sharia laws were abolished, women were granted equal rights with men, and the army and education system were completely restructured along European lines to meet modern requirements. Even the alphabet changed. Instead of the complex and outdated Arabic script, Kemal introduced the Latin alphabet, so that the Turks could more easily master modern science and technology, which contributed to the spread of literacy and knowledge in the country. Thus ended the long and eventful history of the Ottoman Empire. After 6 centuries of wars, conquests, and defeats, it disappeared from the political map of the world, giving way to a new Turkey striving for prosperity and progress. And the man who revived the country from the ashes remained in history as Ataturk, which means father of the Turkish people, a symbol of national pride and independence of Turkey. In 1923, the Ottoman Empire, which had existed for more than 6 centuries and left an indelible mark on world history, finally ceased to exist, giving way to the Turkish Republic. Its last ruler was Sultan Mehmed VI, a man who, until the very last moment, desperately hoped to retain some power and keep the empire from collapsing. But the time of the monarchy in Turkey had come to an end, and history turned towards a new state, a new leader, and a new era, promising change and hope for a better future. Mustafa Kemal, who became a symbol of resistance and the struggle for the independence of Turkey, proclaimed the birth of the Turkish Republic, completely changing the country and its future, directing it on the path of progress and development. The final months of the Sultanate were spent in humiliation and fear under the oppression of foreign powers. After the defeat in World War I, the Ottoman Empire was occupied by the Entente forces. Its territories were divided among the victors, and the capital, Istanbul, was under the control of the British and French, who exercised actual control over the country. During this time, the Sultan's power became purely nominal and had no real significance. Real decisions concerning the future of Turkey were made in London and Paris, and Mehmed VI himself was, in effect, a puppet in the hands of foreign powers, unable to influence the events taking place. When, in 1922, the Grand National Assembly of Turkey, located in Ankara, officially abolished the Sultanate, the Sultan was forced to flee the country, escaping imminent retribution. On the night of November 17th, he secretly boarded the British warship Malaya, which took him to the island of Malta, which was under British control, where he spent the rest of his life in exile. Thus ended the centuries-old history of the Ottoman dynasty, which ruled a vast empire for more than 6 centuries and left an indelible mark on world history. While the last sultan was leaving the country, in Ankara, Mustafa Kemal and his associates were laying the foundations of a new Turkey, free and independent. They understood that the Ottoman legacy was too outdated for the modern world, and that radical reforms in all spheres of life were necessary for the country's prosperity. The Ottoman Empire lived according to laws and traditions that were already several centuries old, and most of its institutions did not meet the requirements of the 20th century, which hampered its development and prevented it from competing with developed European countries. Mustafa Kemal decided to break decisively with the past and create a completely new state, based on the principles of secularism, democracy, and national unity. On October 29, 1923, he officially proclaimed the creation of the Turkish Republic, marking the beginning of a new era in the history of Turkey. On this day, Turkey became a secular national state, and Mustafa Kemal was elected its first president, receiving widespread support from the Turkish people. From that moment on, a new era began, an era of large-scale reforms, modernization, and radical changes aimed at transforming Turkey into a modern and prosperous country. Mustafa Kemal, who later received the title Ataturk, meaning father of the Turks, envisioned Turkey as independent, strong, and modern, capable of taking its rightful place among the developed countries of the world. The first step on the path to a new Turkey was the abolition of the Caliphate, which symbolized religious power and connection with the past. The Ottoman sultans were not only the rulers of the country, but also considered spiritual leaders of the Muslim world, wielding enormous influence over Muslims around the world. Ataturk decided that the new Turkey would not be a theocratic state, and that religion should be separated from the state. In March of 1924, the Caliphate was abolished, and all power passed into the hands of the secular government, ending a centuries-old tradition. Then followed large-scale reforms in all spheres of Turkish society, aimed at modernizing and westernizing the country. Mustafa Kemal changed the education system, creating secular schools so that people could acquire modern knowledge and master new professions necessary for the development of the economy. He replaced the complex and outdated Arabic alphabet with the Latin alphabet, making the Turkish language easier to read and write and promoting literacy among the population. Religious courts were abolished, and the country transitioned to a European legal system which helped to strengthen the rule of law and order in the country. Women were given rights they never had under the Ottomans, which contributed to their emancipation and involvement in public life. Now they could get an education, work equally with men, participate in politics, and hold high government positions. New laws on clothing were introduced, aimed at abandoning traditional Ottoman clothing and adopting a European style. Traditional Ottoman fezzes were banned, and the population was encouraged to wear European suits, symbolizing a commitment to a modern way of life. The economy also required radical changes to meet the demands of the modern world. The Ottoman Empire found itself economically dependent on European banks and foreign capital, a situation that hindered its development and stripped it of its economic independence. Mustafa Kemal, determined to change this, set before himself the task of developing domestic production and agriculture to secure Turkey's economic autonomy. A vigorous campaign began to build roads, factories and enterprises, and the country gradually began its transformation into an industrial nation capable of competing with the developed countries of Europe. These sweeping transformations met with fierce resistance from conservatives and proponents of the old regime who resisted change and sought to preserve the old order. Many were unhappy with the abolition of the caliphate and the weakening of Islam's role in the state, believing it undermined the spiritual foundations of Turkish society. Some military personnel, accustomed to Ottoman traditions and discipline, felt that the country was losing its national identity by copying Western models. However, Mustafa Kemal acted decisively and relentlessly, stopping at nothing to achieve his goal. He suppressed any rebellions and uprisings, quashed any attempts to restore the old order, and even executed conspirators to prevent a return to the past and ensure the changes were irreversible. Yet, despite the decisive break with the Ottoman system, its legacy did not disappear entirely, and many elements of Ottoman culture continue to live on in modern Turkey, reminders of its rich history. Even after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, many Ottoman traditions, customs and cultural values persist in modern Turkey, forming part of its national identity. The architecture of palaces, mosques and fortresses, built during the Ottoman era, still evokes the former glory and grandeur of the empire, captivating with its beauty and magnificence. Many modern Turkish cities grew out of Ottoman trading centers and bazaars, preserving their historical layouts and architectural appearance. Cuisine, music, traditions of hospitality. All these are rooted in the Ottoman past, forming an integral part of Turkish culture. Even Turkey's legal system, despite reforms and the adoption of European legislation, has retained some features of Ottoman law, adapted to modern realities. Moreover, Ottoman influence is not limited to Turkey alone, but extends to other countries that were part of the Ottoman Empire. Former territories of the Ottoman Empire, such as the Balkan Peninsula, the Middle East, and North Africa, still bear traces of Ottoman rule, preserving elements of Ottoman culture and traditions. In Bosnia, Albania, and Kosovo, many people practice Islam, which spread there during the Ottoman era, becoming part of their national identity. In Arab countries, the influence of Ottoman architecture and administrative systems remains, significantly impacting the development of these nations. The Ottoman Empire has vanished from the political map of the world, but its spirit lives on in Turkey and beyond, reminding us of its rich history and cultural heritage. Mustafa Kemal created a new state based on the principles of secularism and modernization, yet the country has not been able to fully shed its past, and the Ottoman legacy continues to play an important role in shaping Turkish identity. Turkey remains a bridge between East and West, between Islamic tradition and European modernization, between the heritage of the Ottoman Empire and aspirations for the future, blending elements of diverse cultures and civilizations.